Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 56th webinar in the Offshore Wind Learning from the Experts series. I am Morgan Brumbauer, a Senior Project Manager with NYSERDA's Environmental Research Team, and it is my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Dr. Annie Murphy with Inspire Environmental. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please contact Ayla Morwin at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series are available on NYSERDA's website using the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Slido feature to submit your questions. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goal of 100% zero-emission electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's expert, Dr. Annie Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a principal scientist at Inspire Environmental with expertise in benthic biogeochemistry, microbial ecology, aquaculture research, and marine environmental change. With nearly 20 years of experience, Dr. Murphy designs and executes research and monitoring programs aimed at understanding the ecology and multifaceted function and value of coastal and offshore benthic habitats and how these may be affected by human activities, including those associated with the development of offshore wind. Thank you for joining us today, and I will now hand over the presentation to Annie.
Great, thank you. As Morgan mentioned, my name is Annie Murphy, and I'm very excited to be here with you all, and I'm happy you're interested in this topic of benthic research and how it correlates with offshore wind. I'm a marine ecosystem ecologist. I think a lot about how humans influence the ecosystem and vice versa. I have a background in sediment biogeochemistry and ecological functions associated with the seafloor. So that's the benthos or the benthic environment. I am a principal ecologist at Inspire, which is based in Newport, Rhode Island. And we're actually a part of Ventera Group, which is headquartered in London, but I spend most of my time just south of Boston at my home office in Massachusetts. So today I'd like to spend some time initially talking about the ecosystems off the US Northeast coast and specifically what benthic habitats are out there and what functions they serve in the environment. I'll provide a brief overview of the environmental permitting and project siting steps for offshore wind, really with a focus and a lens of benthic environmental impacts and how we use data to move through that process. And then finally, I'm excited to explore with you a couple of case studies where we have data including Block Island Wind Farm, Coastal Virginia CVOW, Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Research Array, and finally South Fork Wind Farm. And then I'll end with a couple of thoughts on intentional engineering with the aim of promoting valuable ecosystem functions within the context of offshore wind. So a lot of the work that I do is understanding how the benthos, the sediments, the seafloor, the substrates associated with the sediments, all the marine organisms that are living on, in, and around the seafloor, how that environment functions within the greater ecosystem, and how human activity may shift or alter these functions. So on the left here, you see a plan view or downward facing image of the seafloor in a particular area. And you can note the diverse different sizes of cobble and pebbles and the organisms that are living on there. So that's one type of seafloor. And then on the right, this is a sediment profile image of the seafloor. So it's a worm's eye view or an ant farm view, which is quite different than the one on the left. And you can see that this benthic habitat is quite different than what you see on the left. And both habitats are important. So benthic habitats provide food resources and refuge resources for marine organisms. They also provide and are locations of important nutrient and carbon cycling in the ecosystem. So on the right, that carpet of tubes at the sediment water interface, those are formed by small amphipods. And these amphipods are suspension feeding organisms. So they're drawing phytoplankton from the water column and particulates from the water column down to the sediments. And then that gets cycled in the sediment. So that's a really important, that benthic pelagic coupling is a really important function. And the productivity in the benthos and the supply of food to higher trophic levels, also very important in the ecosystem. We know that as ecologists, we know that as we increase complexity, and by this I mean the different types, different niche spaces of substrate, so different sizes of rocks, mixtures of boulders, cobbles, and pebbles, that increases the value of the habitat in general. It provides a diversity of space and niches that organisms can exploit to hide, to hunt, or to seek refuge and food. So generally, complexity increases habitat value and drives up number of species that are occupying that space or diversity. Here off the coast of the United States in the Northeast, well, in the east, off the East Coast, the Northwest Atlantic continental shelf is very broad, and it is spatially, and it's mostly composed of soft sediments. So a lot of the habitats out there we see are composed of sandy, mobile sediments. So here is a downward facing image of a sandy environment. Clearly, organisms occupy this space. And even though it has low complexity, there are organisms that rely on these habitats. So these are, just like this squid here and these sand dollars. You can see the paired sediment profile image collected at this same location as the inset there on the right. So for generations, humans have been altering the benthic function and benthic functions. And here, we're here to learn about offshore wind. And really one of the most profound effects of offshore wind development is on benthic function. It's this habitat conversion, converting that sandy bottom to rocky bottom, and introducing a structure that really spans from the surface of the ocean down to the seafloor. So this is a new habitat. On the left, you see a monopile foundation that was installed about 2 months before the image was collected, and it's covered in hydroids. So this is an epifaunal or attached organism that is a colonial organism. It's a single species growing on that monopile at that point in time. And on the right is an image, a downward facing image of rock that has been installed at the base of this monopile. It's not the same monopile. This one had been in the water for longer than the one on the left. So when we think about this conversion of habitat, we have to think about how does that change the function of the habitat? How does it change the flow of energy and the organisms that are growing and living on these structures? Okay, so before I dig into these case studies, taking a step back, I know this is obviously not groundbreaking news to anyone attending this webinar, but I do think it's really important to, periodically take a step back, remind each other, and remind ourselves about the importance of advancing the development of renewable energy sources. We know our planet is warming at really an alarming rate due to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is resulting in a suite of cascading impacts that we see in the news all the time. So we need a source of renewable energy. We need to transition, and it's happening, which is great. So offshore wind here in the bottom right is a distribution kind of over time, the expected shift in those energy sources. So offshore wind is providing reliable, renewable energy efficiently to coastal states, and it's able to do that. Here, I'm going to start talking mainly about the US. So this is actually an outdated map. This, I think, was last year. So this is a map that's showing, just demonstrating the ongoing US East Coast development. There's been some pauses recently. We all know that, but there are commercially functioning offshore wind off our coasts at this point. So we have, let's see, the 3 case studies I'm going to be talking about. So Block Island Wind Farm is just off the coast of Rhode Island, up in the northern part of that map. To the east of that is South Fork Wind, which is the first commercially operated commercial scale wind farm in federal waters in the US. And then down the southern portion of this map is CVOW. So there are 2 research turbines off the coast of Virginia in the mid-Atlantic that I'll be talking about. So offshore wind is really a part of this solution, this renewable energy. It's a really important part. So before we get moving on installing these wind farms, we know there's a lot of steps that go into getting a wind farm and a project up and running. There's a lot of work that's done. Here's a really very oversimplified and actually probably outdated at this point timeline for a US offshore wind project to become functional. So it starts here in the US with the federal government figuring out basically where to site these farms. Takes many years, input from a variety of different people and groups, and ultimately we get these call areas that then get carved out into lease areas. Once these leases are auctioned off to interested companies, US offshore wind developers, they get to work collecting project-specific baseline data. So this is the site investigation. This information flows into their construction and operations plan that gets through the process of permitting, and I'll get into this in a second. So once an offshore wind developer is awarded a lease, they get going on collecting their own data to understand what the benthic habitat is in their lease area. So they have a sense, obviously this was informed and this lease area was selected for a number of different reasons, but the US offshore wind developer is able to collect a variety of different data to inform their siting and their permitting. So the first is this high resolution multi-beam and side scan data that's used to map the seafloor. So I'm showing a couple of different data products from these surveys. So bathymetry, backscatter, and side scan. And you can see from this geophysical data, we can pick up on different seafloor features, such as sand waves and also rocky areas. And so if we overlay these data against the project plan. So you see this is a hypothetical project. So you see where the turbines might be planned and the export cables might be planned to connect them. Once we have that kind of large scale detailed habitat map, we will couple that with ground truth sampling. So we use a sediment, as I introduced before, a sediment profile camera and a plan view camera that collects paired images. And we use this imagery to ground truth the geophysical data and to understand, okay, so this is where the sand is, and we interpret the geophysical data coupled with this ground truth data to develop and integrate the data to develop project-specific benthic habitat maps. So these benthic habitat maps are then used. So here is an image kind of showing going from desktop data on the left. So just showing sediment type, inferred sediment type, modeled sediment type, into on the right, overlaying the project-specific interpreted benthic habitats on the right. And so getting beyond that desktop data and getting into the delineations of these different habitats. So taking those interpreted benthic habitat maps, we want to crosswalk those to the function of those habitats. Who is occupying that space? What important species are relying on those habitats, and how sensitive are they to different stressors? So this flows into the essential fish habitat assessment, linking the benthic habitats distributions across the lease area to the species of interest and the distribution of those species within the context of those habitats. And then using that, the benthic habitat maps are also used as the project develops to microsite the different components of the project. So we're able to use the maps to inform where a monopile might be placed to avoid and to minimize impacts to particular locations or habitats that might be sensitive to specific stressors. Same goes for micrositing cable routes, for example. So this is a zoomed in image. You see the overlay of the different habitat types, the location of the previous location of the turbine monopile, and then it's been microsited down to sort of avoid that complex habitat in the center. So that detailed benthic habitat map really becomes part of the basis by which environmental impact assessments are done. So understanding that this is the baseline, so how do we expect, or how do we hypothesize this baseline to shift as a result of the activity that's being proposed, that wind turbine being installed? And really, this is a formulation of hypotheses. This is what we expect to happen. But maybe if we do it this way, it will mitigate or it will minimize that potential effect. So accounting for different potential project scenarios. The wind developers are required as a part of the construction operation plan to draft and then ultimately execute benthic habitat monitoring plans. And these monitoring plans span from pre-construction through operations. Generally, these monitoring plans are aimed at monitoring for specific expectations, monitoring for and being able to detect potential unexpected consequences. And so these monitoring plans, they vary across different lease areas, but most of them are structured against, a certain hypothesis that is going to be tested with that pre-construction and post-construction data collection. So getting into, what do we expect to happen? So when we know that when we install or introduce novel or new structures, like hard structures like rock piles or piers or other structures like monopiles to the marine environment, this can lead to shifts in the distribution of species and also shifts in the energy distribution and how productivity might shift. And this varies across spatial and temporal scales. So I tend to think of the artificial reef effect, the introduction and response of the environment to the introduction of new structures, in kind of two buckets that are very much related. So the species distributions and energy distributions. In terms of shifts in species, so there are studies that show the succession of epifauna or benthic species growing on the structures themselves and how that might shift over time. This is, again, a new habitat that is colonized by species. This changes the community structure, the diversity. There are also hypotheses about the potential effect of offshore wind and introduction of novel structures to facilitate poleward expansion of species, allowing this kind of as a stepping stone to allow species to move northward. And of course, there's a potential for opportunistic or non-indigenous, non-native species and invasive species to colonize these structures. So these are all kind of hypotheses centered around the change in species distribution with a focus on those benthic species. And so once you change who's living there, you're changing how the energy is flowing through the system. So there's a redistribution of energy in the system, and energy is equivalent to carbon and nutrients. And so most of the dominant species that are colonizing these new structures, the monopiles and the scour protection, these are suspension feeders. So just like those two building amphipods that I showed in the beginning, they're filtering the water column, they're packaging up phytoplankton, that food that's growing in the water column, that primary production, packaging that up into their own biomass. So they're using it to grow, that's secondary production, and they're using it, and that secondary production can then flow into higher trophic levels. So again, that function of the benthic environment providing food resources to higher trophic levels. Some of it gets packaged up into waste, and that waste gets consumed by other organisms. It gets respired by microbial processes. Some of it gets shuttled to the seafloor and provides an additional food resource to those organisms that are hanging out around the base of the monopiles. So these, again, studies documenting this, and studies hypothesizing these shifts. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of all these papers, but I put this up really to demonstrate that there's a lot of research happening across the globe to understand how introducing offshore wind structures influences benthic habitats and the function of these systems. This is really only a small smattering of studies that have been published, and the papers I'm showing are really only from the past year or two. So, and there's been way more studies, previously. So a lot of the knowledge that we know is coming from where there's a lot of offshore wind structures and where monitoring has taken place and data has been collected, and that's in the North Sea in Europe. But we do have a lot of data here in the US as well. So I wanted to focus today on the data collected here in the US. So starting with Block Island Wind Farm. So let's talk about testing those hypotheses of changing species distributions, changing carbon distributions. So Block Island Wind Farm, it consists of 5 steel jacket foundations, and each turbine is 6 megawatts. It's located about 5 kilometers southeast of Block Island in Rhode Island. So the Block Island is a small island off of the southern coast of Rhode Island. Construction of these 5 jackets was completed in 2016, so almost 10 years ago. And in that time, we're learning a lot about habitat creation that's resulted from this construction. The jackets, the wind farm itself is positioned in a mosaic of surrounding existing habitats, so including rocky areas, sandy areas, and here are a couple of recent papers that are looking at shifts in fish distribution, benthic organism distribution, epifauna, as a result of this wind farm being constructed. So I'm going to get into a couple of these, just a very high-level overview of these studies. So the first is a 7-year study that took monthly trawls to look at potential shifts in fish distributions associated with the construction of Block Island Wind. They found it was a BACI design, before-after control impact study design. They found no statistically significant change in the common species that were sampled following construction. There was a huge temporal variation that was more common and more substantial than spatial differences in the different quadrats that they were trawling. They did find that structure-associated species, including black sea bass and cod, were increased at the Block Island Wind trawl lines, transects, compared to the reference area. So this is just demonstrating that artificial reef effect. These structure-associated species are attracted to those foundations. One of the main findings was that, or main points that was made in the paper, is that about 750,000 fish and invertebrates were caught over those 7 years. So we're learning, that we learned from this study, and one of the main points is that perhaps we don't need to harvest this many animals to get at other new questions that we want to ask, and perhaps we shift to new monitoring techniques. The same team based at Inspire, they also conducted a ventless trap monitoring program. One of the objectives, there were several objectives of this study. Again, it was over 7 years. This was to determine potential effects of the wind farm on the southern New England stock of American lobster, commercially important lobster here in the U.S. Again, the survey occurred from 2013 to 2019, spanning from pre to post construction, sampling 2 times per month from May through October. They did find a decrease in lobster catches over time at both the reference and the wind farm areas, and this was reflected in the regional trends of this population due to climate stressors. So the study concluded that there was no adverse impact of turbine installation activities on the lobster catches. And then finally, another kind of vignette is a recent study that was published, a whole lot of data by Fonseca et al. They were looking at a more local scale changes in the epibenthic, the attached organisms on the structures themselves, as well as the in-funnel communities around the turbines, those jackets. The main point here, lots of data was available to dig through here over a number of years. They highlighted natural and stochastic mechanisms governing the benthic communities. So there's a lot of change over time of the benthic community structure with no real climax, or the community didn't stabilize over time, year over year. As I mentioned before, 2 of those studies were extractive. So they were collecting physical samples of fish and invertebrates and collected a lot of them. So we're moving towards using asking different questions, different scales, using different techniques. And there's a lot of different techniques out there for sampling. These are a suite of different approaches that are all non-extractive. So using underwater imagery, including those sediment profiles, ROV-derived imagery, small drones, baited remote underwater video to look at mobile taxa in particular areas. So the tool should really match the question and the monitoring objectives, really. And understanding that the tool you use influences the inference you can make with the data. Okay, so moving down, all the way down to the mid-Atlantic, this is off the coast of Virginia. There are 2 research turbines. These are monopiles, and they were constructed, just 2 of them, in 2020. And this is the CVOW research array. So here's a map showing the location of the research array, just really off the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay off Virginia. And the yellow part of the map is the commercial, CVOW commercial area that's under construction right now. So we have conducted annual underwater visual surveys at CVOW, these 2 monopiles, over the past several years. And we're using the underwater imagery to document community composition, percent cover of the dominant species, and the fish communities present. So digging a little bit into the CVOW data, I'm going to show you how on these panels, this is 1 panel per year, so 2020 to 2024. I'm going to show you with water depth on the vertical axis, the number of observations of different species. So the different species are the colors at the top. And so in 2020, we see with water depth, kind of a combination of algae, so brown and red algae, mixed with bryozoa hydroids. So these are the fast-growing epifauna that are fast-growing and opportunistic, and they're able to colonize relatively quickly once a structure is installed. So this is 2020. It was about 3 or 4 months after the monopiles were actually installed. So we see some species colonizing. 2022, so 2 years later, this has shifted where we see more types of colors, so more species. Mussels are an important contribution to the community, so those are the blue. And we still see that algae all the way down to the sea floor. So this goes down to about 20 meters. So it's still photic at that depth. 2023 and 2024, number of observations have increased, so that the amount of different types of species is increasing over time, and those observations have increased. The next couple of slides, or next couple of figures, will show you relative percent cover. So this gives you a sense for the dominant taxa that's attached to the monopiles. So in 2020, we really were seeing mainly brown and red algae, and there wasn't a ton of growth at depth. In 2022, again, the dominant taxa was mussels with almost 100% cover. And these mussels are found intermixed with other species that are of lesser dominance. And then by 2024, we had mainly bryozoa hydroids colonizing the deeper areas, with the mussels kind of dominant, partially dominant in the mid depths, 8 to 10 meters. So there's definitely a depth gradient, and there's a temporal gradient. So as we look at the actual imagery here, so this is showing the same the same data, but it's the imagery that we're used to derive the data I was just showing. So in 2020, this is at the shallower portion of the monopiles. We mainly saw algae, then a thick layer of mussels were colonized in 2022. Those mussels were found to have gaps in that colonization in 2023, and then algae returned in 2024. We have data from this year, but it's obviously not been included yet into our data set. This is deeper down into the water column. So again, at those depths, mostly bare, then it converted to 2 years later, a thick layer of mussels. Mussels tended to decrease in percent cover, and then hydroids really took over, and there's thick carpets of hydroids living in this region. Okay, and then, so this is my last case study. This is South Fork Wind Farm. So South Fork is the first commercial scale operational wind farm in federal waters off the US East Coast. So this is our very first commercial scale wind farm. It's located in southern New England off the coast of Rhode Island. And the export cable, it's composed of 13 monopile structures, including the substation. The cable route makes landfall and comes to shore on the south side of Long Island. At this wind farm, which was constructed and operated by Ørsted, they have a comprehensive fisheries and benthic monitoring program associated with this project. And I want to give a quick overview of the results of that. So recently, Inspire Venterra Group published a story map that provides an overview of the first several years of benthic monitoring that's been collected at South Fork. If you use your phone or copy the URL at the bottom, but you should be able to scan this QR code. It will take you to the story map. And I want to kind of stay on this slide for a minute, but so South Fork and Ørsted they've really invested a lot of resources at first developing this comprehensive seafloor monitoring program. It's coupled with their fisheries monitoring program, and it includes studies that span from pre-construction, construction, and post-construction time periods. It was really designed to be comprehensive. It's aimed to protect the valuable resources that we find offshore. And preliminary results are providing really promising visuals and data suggesting that these new habitats are being colonized by important species. And the artificial reef is really in effect here. The monitoring program itself is a part of the Fisheries Research and Monitoring Plan, which is publicly available. So the benthic piece is it's structured based on 4 main hypotheses, related to our expectations on how the ecosystem will respond to this project. The hypotheses are around, what are the epifauna colonizing the new structures? So we expect epifauna to colonize the new structures. And these new structures that we're looking at are the monopile foundations, the scour protection around the monopiles, and some cable mattresses along the export cable. We're looking at the native benthic habitat that's surrounding the new structure. So remember, I was talking about all this epifauna growing on the monopiles, perhaps shuttling additional food resources to the surrounding sea floor. So we're looking to see if there's shifts in the organic enrichment around the structures. We're having a look at the communities, the benthic habitats along the export cable route. We expect that any disturbance associated with the export cable installation would be short-lived and temporary. And then finally, the fourth hypothesis is looking at boulder relocation, and we expect that this activity of moving native natural boulders, this activity would have limited effects on the epifauna, those organisms living on the boulders, and the organisms that live in close association with those boulders. So all four of those hypotheses are being tested, and data are being collected over years to get at those questions. So I would love if you came to the story map and had a look at the results yourself. And this study is certainly ongoing. We're actually have a survey going right now and another one starting next week. So if you do get to the story map, you'll see some nice imagery that are really outlined here. So I won't go into detail here, but what we're seeing is the artificial reef effect. We see that these new hard habitats, the ROV imagery is documenting epifauna growing on the surfaces, and that epifauna, those communities shifting over time. We saw an increase in diversity and abundance of attached organisms over 2 years of data collection. So as I mentioned, we have these foundations, we have the scour protection we're having a look at, and we have the cable mattresses. So this is imagery of the scour protection around a monopile. This was installed about a year after, or this imagery was collected about a year after installation. And if you look carefully, you can see a American lobster in the right of the image. And then another novel hard habitat, new structure is the cable mattresses. So this is one image from one location of the study area about a year after the mattresses were installed. I mentioned the adjacent habitats around those foundations. We're using sediment profile imagery to look at organic enrichment. So on the right, this is a paired image collection. So on the left is the downward facing image, and on the right is a profile image. And if there was organic enrichment, we would be able to detect that in the profile, because that optically distinct anaerobic sediment is really prominent, but we have not yet seen that in the surrounding habitats. So we've not seen any demonstrable changes to the benthic function of the seafloor adjacent to the foundations in the lease area. These are some images from along the export cable. This was just like the previous slide. This is a before-after gradient design where we have stations positioned with increasing distance from the site of disturbance. And similarly, we have not found any demonstrable changes associated with the benthic functions of the seafloor adjacent to that export cable. Have a look at the story map. There's some really exciting images of these natural boulders out there in the lease area. These are really the first high resolution images of these boulders. We know they're there because of the geophysical data, but to see them up close. So this is a community composed of bryozoa and barnacles. These are anemones that are retracted, and there's some bivalves on the right there, and some sea stars and other encrusting taxa. So we used a before-after control impact, looking at boulders that were relocated and control boulders nearby, and compared the communities. And we saw no difference between those two treatments. And then, of course, the story map will give you a nice summary of the species, of the mobile species, some of the fun species to look at. So kind of landing on, we know we're getting a lot of data on all of those 3 case studies were wind farms here in the US that have not that are using traditional standard materials for construction and engineering. We're seeing really exciting results on who's living there. There is a lot of conversation about, can we make these structures better, more valuable? I think it's really important to, incorporating different nature inclusive or nature-based design elements to the scour protection, for example, to the foundations. I think it's important we are careful to what we're trying to achieve, what value and what species are we trying to promote. We need to make sure we have a target or a goal. We need to understand that the local environment and the regional environment will really play a strong role in the performance of any of these, intentionally engineered elements. And we need to pinpoint, what it is we're trying to aiming to achieve, and following through in terms of monitoring for that objective, and identifying those goals. And yeah, as I mentioned, that performance will definitely depend on the surrounding environment, and other uses of that seascape. So in conclusion, if we build it, we know that this is a shift in benthic habitat type. We need to understand kind of beyond biodiversity, but really, how does this shifting the ecosystem function? Understanding that we should set specific goals if we're going to change the engineering of these structures to promote particular ecological functions. Monitoring should be based on hypotheses, and location will be important, and spatial and temporal scales are also important. So with that, I thank you for your interest and your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Annie, for that really great overview. For folks who have joined, if you have questions, please use the Slido function, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. I guess we'll just start off looking at, are there other examples we can learn from as offshore wind development advances, either from overseas or other industries, about how habitats might change based on human activities related to offshore energy development?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of data in the literature on oil and gas rigs, for example, and how those new structures are colonized and used by different species. I think it's really important to know and to keep everyone understanding that the environment and where these structures are placed is really going to be important in terms of how the ecosystem responds to that shift. So we know a lot about the North Sea. They have similar species, they have similar habitats, but it's a different ecosystem. So it's worth, exploring here as well.
Excellent. There's a couple of questions about the process for planning and micrositing, and some of the rules and regulations that could be used to determine, which habitats are sensitive to stressors, how should they be avoided? Are there aspects in the permitting process that, we can look at? And then I have a follow-up question along the same lines.
Sure, it's a great question, and it's a really weighted question. So there are a lot of different resources that are at play, and a lot of different stakeholders, and it takes years to permit these projects, and there's many people involved. I'm the lonely benthic ecologist, fisheries and cultural aspects. So there are a lot of different considerations when we're thinking about where to place these structures, and consultation with federal and state agencies keep that balance in those conversations. So in my opinion, we're doing a pretty good job at citing these locations, these wind farms.
And along the same lines, we have seen kind of a slowdown or a pause on the federal side. And is there anything that could be done in this kind of slowdown on the research or siting side that can help impact the permitting process so that, if things change in the future, we're ready to respond?
Yes. So I'm trying to be optimistic at this time, and taking a kind of a silver lining mindset where maybe this is an opportunity for us to take a step. We're collecting a lot of data at the projects that have squeezed through, that are under construction and that will be operational soon. And so let's synthesize the data we've collected. Let's understand how those locations have changed, and use that to inform future permitting and future construction and future monitoring. We don't need to necessarily continue collecting all of this imagery, all of this data, if we have a good sense of how the ecosystem will respond. So using this as an opportunity to synthesize the data that are being collected, to inform the path forward.
A question here about, maybe diving a little bit deeper in, if you can talk to this. Has there been any work comparing what we see on monopiles to jackets, as it seems like there is potential for maybe different colonization or artificial reef effects from those different projects?
Yeah, I don't know if there has been a study actually comparing them in the same location. So jackets are usually used in shallower areas like off Block Island compared to monopiles. So that sort of confounds the results if you do a direct comparison. Jackets certainly provide more niche space. They're a little more complex than that surface of the monopile. So that might be, influencing the species that are colonizing and the diversity of the species colonizing there. Yeah, so those are my initial thoughts on that comparison.
And kind of along the same lines, as we see these structures get colonized and there's a potential for an artificial reef effect, as we think in the future, as these things, are out there for 25, 30 plus years, what are your thoughts about how these structures might play an important role in benthic habitats during the decommissioning phase of the project?
Yeah, there are some, pros and cons to decommissioning. I think we have to think about, over longer time scales, beyond 30 years, what we want this space to look like and how we want to use this space. So in the North Sea, they're beginning to decommission foundations and projects because they've reached their life cycle. And some folks are saying, hey, why are we taking these out? They're like beautiful artificial reefs. They're increasing productivity, and they have that kind of thought. But we can't just continue leaving things in place if they're no longer serving their original goal. And so decommissioning is important in that aspect. And also, maybe we need to decommission these so we can use that space for a larger, more efficient turbine. And so maybe the technology will have changed in 30 years that allows for that. And maybe those next generation can stand to be there longer.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I know it's always a question that comes up about decommissioning. What's what's best to do.
Yeah.
Shifting a little bit to maybe talk about some of the methods used. And maybe you can expand a little bit more on recommendations to switching to non-extractive methods, and if there are any published papers that we can point the public to that could help provide some more details about comparable and comparing extractive and non-extractive methods.
Yeah, couple of things come to mind. So I am based at a company that we were formed by one of our co-founders invented the sediment profile image camera. And we see this as a way to look at particular potential impacts associated with offshore wind. And we see it as a really effective way to sample baseline conditions. Instead of using grab sampling that give you a whole lot of data, right? So if you take a grab and you count all the worms and all the critters that are living in that chunk of sediment, you get a community matrix and you get a ridiculous amount of data. Not ridiculous, but it's really useful. But it's really stochastic, and changes associated with which worm is where and when. That gives you a lot of data and not a lot of information. So we think of it as let's see. So it doesn't really matter which worm is there as long as that worm is functioning as a food resource, for example, or is bioturbating that habitat. And we can get that from the camera. In terms of other non-extractive techniques, so for fisheries, there are a couple of papers recently looking at the use of eDNA and comparing that with trawl data, for example. eDNA tends to pick up a lot more species than the trawl data. There's lots of questions about, the turnover rate of DNA in the environment and how that might bias the data, but it certainly provides a very comprehensive view of what species are in the neighborhood. And then finally, with baited remote underwater video, this is a great tool to use to look at habitat use by mobile fauna like fish and other invertebrates that are moving around the system. So this is a stereo camera that has a piece of bait. Sometimes people call them squid pops sometimes. So they have a piece of bait and it's a camera having a look at that pole with bait attached to it. You have to remember that this is a different spatial scale than a trawl. So a trawl is surveying a much larger swath. When you want to look at this location, what species are using this habitat, BRUV, or baited remote underwater video, is a great tool to use.
And then we have time for one more question, so I'm going to try and combine a couple of things. If I'm a member of the public, where can I learn more about ongoing research? Do other programs or other projects use storyboards to package their data and their information together? I think just pointing to some places where the public can learn more about this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think just as, the US offshore wind industry is early, it's new. I mean, it's for some people that have been in the field for a long time, it's many years old, decades. But it does take some time to ramp up the knowledge transfer to the public. I know that one developer, Equinor, is creating a learning lab of sorts down in Brooklyn Marine Terminal. I don't know the details of when that's opening, but that's one spot that people can actually go and learn for themselves, walk around and exhibit and learn from themselves about offshore wind and the ecology of offshore wind. let's see, story maps are a great tool. People can have a look themselves. We were really fortunate that Ørsted, who funded all of the South Fork Wind and continues to pour resources into that monitoring program, was really supportive of us developing that story map. And so, yeah, that I don't know of any other story maps, but hopefully people will catch on and start making more.
Great, and thank you for addressing those questions. And I think we will now start to close out the presentation for today. So thank you for those who attended. Again, thank you for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Our next webinar in this series will take place on Wednesday, August 13th, featuring Joseph Mykut with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who will discuss how offshore wind contributes to domestic energy security. You can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out our past webinars in this series on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. If you would like to request a topic or a speaker for this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our events page. Thank you again, Annie, for joining us, and thank you to our participants. See you next time.